Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and it's true that Boris Johnson is almost certainly the worst Prime Minister we've had in modern times, but certainly in my lifetime, for such a crisis. But he's the one we have, and in this video I'd like to discuss the difficult minefield that Johnson has to navigate us through if he's going to preserve his political career. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I am a firm believer in the first step to solving a problem being to acknowledge it objectively and without shame getting in the way. Doesn't matter what caused the problem, doesn't matter how you got there, face it and then work out what you need to do to solve it. And it's a belief that's been reinforced by over 2 decades of teaching. You can see it time and time again. Students that face up to their errors, don't shy away from it, decide that it's something to learn from, seeing mistakes as an opportunity to grow. These are the ones who have no regrets when the results come in. Then you have the other ones, could be perfectly bright students, but they don't like facing up to mistakes. They don't like asking questions. They don't like being wrong. They see it as something to be ashamed of. And they always underperform. And so it is in all aspects of life. So has the newly returned Boris Johnson faced up to the crisis at last and made efforts to tackle it head on? Has his life changed him in any way? Possibly in private, that may be the case, I can't say not, but certainly not in public. It is true that we have finally had some figures of deaths from outside of hospitals added to our official total. They've abandoned the notion, oh, well, other countries don't count those deaths, so we won't either, because actually comparable countries have been. Thus proving, of course, that we were deliberately downplaying our own figures. So for all those who were trying to defend the government by pointing to countries that were downplaying them, well, we were one of those countries. We still are, of course. The official figure is nowhere near the real figure. And for all the talk, as I say, of Tory MPs about how unfair it is to compare us to other countries, there are plenty of comparisons that are absolutely fair. Not all, by all means. Germany, for example, is very comparable. It's a European country. It has a higher population than us, so anyone moaning about per capita higher population than us, they report all deaths, all of them. And when there's any doubt about what killed someone, they are tested to make sure that, to find out if it was COVID or it was not. They are recording a quarter of the deaths that we are. And ours are massively underreported, even by the admission of cabinet ministers. So was Boris Johnson open about this in his first press conference back from his illness and the birth of his latest child? No. He tried to say that we've succeeded. Oh, let's celebrate this great success. He said that other countries would look to us to learn from our success. I mean, our success? We are arguably the least successful country in the whole world when it comes to handling this crisis. Honestly. True, you could point to the USA as having worse figures, but they have a much larger population. You could point to Italy for having worse per capita figures, but they got on top of it much more quickly than we did. Not quickly enough. They acted late, but not as late as us, and they didn't try and fudge things once they did decide to act. And although, coming back to America, I mean, it would be even worse were it not for President Bonehead. Individual states were able to take action in a way that couldn't happen as easily as in the UK. He also said in his press conference that no patients were denied a ventilator, as if that, he's pushing this idea that we provided the health service to cope with this. No. It may well be true that no patient was denied a ventilator, but that was only because he didn't allow those who were dying of COVID to become patients if it would mean not being able to access critical care. The fact of the matter is that many thousands, tens of thousands of people have died outside of hospital. Now, some of those may have died without ever reporting symptoms to the NHS. But we know that many thousands did and were told to piss off. No, you are not eligible for healthcare. So that basically means that the healthcare system was overwhelmed. That's the simple definition. It was overwhelmed because it wasn't able to take patients that needed that care. And as I say, many thousands of them. And the entire press conference was basically a tissue of lies designed for nothing more than political spin. He knows that those who can critically evaluate information already knew that he's cocked things up and he's not going to persuade us otherwise. But there are still plenty in the country who can be fooled, and that's what this performance was all about. It was all about them. And, and I know some people will look at performances like this and think, how does he think he can get away with it? He's not trying to fool you. He's not trying to convince you. He knows you're lost to him. He's just trying to convince the majority, which is fine for him politically, at least in the short term, but it doesn't help him solve the crisis, because the crisis isn't over. Never mind what the papers seem to be reporting, even a suggestion that we're over the worst of it. I hope we are. But if we don't get things right from here on in, at least, if they're not at least privately facing up to the situation, then there is worse still to come. People point out with the case of the Spanish flu pandemic that the second wave was much worse than the first. Now, this is something that Boris Johnson is genuinely seized of. He's genuinely afraid of that. And, there is a risk of a much worse peak to come. And he knows that if we relax too much too early. And as I say, Boris Johnson gets that. He said so publicly. But there was a clear undermining of this government message from the right-wing press throughout the entire week. The week began with stories in the press of lockdown measures being eased imminently. Boris was back and he's going to be announcing the easing of measures. All sorts of mad schemes were being discussed as if the announcement was coming this week, as if they were reporting something ministers had privately told them, but they hadn't officially announced. But Boris Johnson started the week by saying that it would be dangerous to ease the lockdown too early. That told me he wasn't planning to ease it at all this week. But that didn't stop the newspapers. They carried on throughout the week, talking as if Boris Johnson would be announcing an end to at least some of the lockdown measures this week. Then, on Wednesday, Dominic Raab said in Prime Minister's Questions that the government hadn't adopted an exit strategy. He insisted that the government would not adopt one. It's not just that they weren't telling us what it is. They said they hadn't even decided on one, and they weren't going to until SAGE, the scientific panel, had agreed a position themselves. I mean, that's an official statement in Parliament that we were not even planning to ease the restrictions imminently. That meant, of course, you can't ease anything this week. Still didn't stop those papers from carrying on, and it was very much as if they were trying to browbeat the government into ending the lockdown measures because it suited the purposes of the people who own those newspapers. They were still writing articles as if Friday would see a sudden end to some of the restrictions, even after all these statements from the government clearly stating, no, we are not. Indeed, if there is evidence of people unilaterally breaking the restrictions of late, especially this week in much greater numbers, I would wonder how much of it is down to these very reckless newspapers normalising the idea of doing so, making it seem socially acceptable to break the rules when the government's entire strategy hinges on the opposite, making it socially unacceptable to ignore the lockdown restrictions. So the first major piece of leadership Johnson is going to have to engage in is getting people to accept that life is not getting back to normal for some time, and even when things do start to ease, you're not going to be completely going back to normal anytime soon. But this is against a background of the popular press briefing against his strategy, against his message. He has to persuade people to get back on the lockdown horse if indeed they've got off it. And this may not be easy for someone who is known to be a liar, a pathological liar. Even amongst his supporters, they accept this. It's undeniable. When the normally Tory supporting newspapers are talking about how we're past the worst, that the lockdown should now be eased, and also throwing in the odd story about how the crack the government have been on supplying equipment to the NHS to distract them. Even the Daily Mail, who don't mind at all distracting attention away from Tory failures, had Piers Morgan write an article absolutely tearing down the government's record in this crisis. Boris Johnson will almost certainly get away with his failures in this crisis if he can keep a lid on it. It's disappointing to say, but that's unfortunately what's likely to happen. His stock doesn't seem to have fallen much, and the government are already stitching up the inevitable inquiries, as I already discussed earlier today. It has been reported, for those who didn't see that video, that the inquiry that's going to take place into the deaths of healthcare workers is not going to be able to investigate potential PPE shortages as a factor. Expect lots of guidelines like that for investigators that completely whitewash the entire episode. But I have long argued that Johnson's lies work only on people not directly affected. If he doesn't keep a lid on the crisis, and we end up in a situation where a majority of the country personally knows someone who has died because of government failures, they will be much less willing to believe the lies. People tend to be a lot less forgiving when they personally are harmed, especially Conservative supporters who have, by definition, a more selfish approach to life and politics anyway. Conservatism, after all, is the politics of self, And if Johnson can keep a lid on the crisis, well, then he has the economic crisis to deal with, and that will be a doozy. Sure, people will cut him a little slack because the blame can be laid squarely at the feet of the microbe, and he will know that he won't actually have to grow the economy as such. Cameron and May never did, and yet they won general elections. They just told people they were doing the economy some good, and people believed it. He could do the same, no problem at all. Johnson doesn't even have to worry about an election for a few more years. But it comes down to that personal effect. If the UK does much worse than comparable nations when it comes to the economic recovery, then he may still pay a political price, especially if we do genuinely have an opposition now that can point this out very loudly to the country. Let us hope. And if we suffer shortages of food and medicines, then we know from recent experience that even the right-wing press will not keep that as quiet as Boris Johnson would like to think. The problem for Johnson is that he isn't going to deal with this economic crisis with capitalism. In fact, measures already taken by the Treasury and trumpeted by the government are right out of the socialist playbook, and more may well be needed. He'll be taxing the rich next. That will be a sight to see. Not himself, I'm sure, though. And the larger issue is that this is a genuinely complex problem. It's not like the problems of Brexit. They're actually quite straightforward to fix. This is genuinely complex and is going to need an analytical eye for detail. Boris Johnson doesn't care about details. He doesn't do details. We know this. This is beyond dispute. He gives a general political policy aim, and as far as he's concerned, it's up to others to sort out the details and make it happen. This is why, during his time as Mayor of London, he announced all sorts of policy decisions that didn't actually materialise, apart from all the terrible ones like closing down police stations and things like that. But the problem is that that's not going to wash here, if indeed it ever did in easier times. He has a botched healthcare crisis where the correct action was to go against his conservative principles, and he will almost certainly botch the economic crisis as well, where those same conservative principles will also pull him away from the correct action, which means even if he eventually takes it, it will be later than it should have been. But that's my reading of things anyway. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.